Welcome everyone. So excited to have you join us today for our next installation of our coffee break webinar entitled Continuous Improvement in the Real World, How to Use Developmental Evaluation to Realize Your Vision. Before jumping into the conversation for today, I did want to provide some contextual information for why we're having this conversation. So over the past 2 years, we've hosted a little bit over a dozen webinars. And the topic that has been the most, generated the most interest, conversation, as well as views on our YouTube page has been related to developmental evaluation. We've received a lot of reach out, questions, points of clarification, and just overall interest. So we wanted to follow up on some of the ideas that we presented earlier. So if you haven't seen the previous webinar on developmental evaluation, I encourage you to go back and review that. And another motivation for today's topic is that I think in solicitations, there's a greater emphasis on continuous improvement. And developmental evaluations is a great approach for being able to achieve that. And that could also be partly why it's a highly viewed topic. It's because you're seeing this more within solicitations. So, we've always seen an emphasis on formative evaluation, but I think that what you're seeing now is this greater emphasis on just more dialogue around continuous improvement. So you may have seen this if you are in the NSF space, looking at the ESTIM solicitation. The most recent solicitation had more information, I think, about continuous improvement. And also, I think what's changed over, I would say, at least the last 15 years that I've been working kind of in this practice with the RUX group, is that there's more emphasis in not just completing a formative evaluation, but how is that really going to be used, and that information is going to be used by the project team. And in the same vein, I would just pull out the DOL, Strengthening Community Colleges solicitation as well. But there's actually in the most recent solicitation real emphasis in trying to explain what is developmental evaluation, what is kind of adaptive evaluation, and the role that that can play in really trying to evaluate initiatives. So you're just seeing more of this within solicitations. So with that as background, what I would really like to be able to achieve for today is to be able to demonstrate how the principles of developmental evaluation can be used for continuous improvement. And towards that end, there are a couple of things that I want to do. First, I just want to define developmental evaluation and provide some context relative to summative and formative evaluation about what developmental evaluation is. Then I want to talk about what are some of those key characteristics of the evaluator and the project team to be able to effectively implement a developmental evaluation. One of the components that you'll see as we have this conversation is that the difference is not so much in terms of the methods with developmental evaluation. What distinguishes developmental evaluation, I think, from other forms is really in terms of the mindset and the approach that you take to the learning process. So I want to talk about what the evaluator needs to bring to that space, and then what the project team needs to bring to that space. And then I want to be able just to walk through a developmental evaluation in practice, give some, in the short amount of time that we have, get some kind of highlights in what that looks like. And then, of course, be able to answer your questions. So if this is the first time you've joined us, I am Lana Rux, Principal Consultant with the RUX Group. And the RUX Group is a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past 14, almost 15 years, we've worked with a number of higher ed institutions, primarily higher ed institutions, related to federally funded grants, such as those funded by the National Science Foundation, Department of Labor, and Department of Education. And then, of course, we also have with us Elise Hopes, our outreach coordinator. So I'll turn things over to her for a moment for her to be able to share what her role will be on the webinar today. Elise?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Lana mentioned, my name is Elise Hopes, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the REX Group. For today's webinar, I'll be helping to facilitate some of the Q&A portions that occur throughout the webinar. So as questions emerge for you, feel free to ask them, and you can ask them by looking for that question mark symbol that appears on the right side of your screen. I do want to say too that there is a little bit of a delay from the time that you send in your question and when we receive it on our end. So if we don't get to it right away, we'll do our best to try to get to it at the next segment. And anything that doesn't get answered during our 30 minutes together, we'll be sure to follow up with you all through email afterwards. There's also a chat function which we may use to share other resources with you all or just other general communications. And then with this function, I do want to say that this will only appear after there's a new message for you to review. So be on the lookout for that symbol as on the right side as well. With that, I'm going to pass it back over to you, Lana, so we can go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks so much, Elise, for that background information. So let's go ahead and get started first by defining what developmental evaluation is. So again, I mentioned that we had a webinar earlier, and if you've seen that, you will be familiar with this definition, or if you're familiar with Michael Quinn Patton's work, familiar with this definition of developmental evaluation as it's supporting innovation development to guide adaptation to emergent and dynamic realities in complex environments. And so there's a lot within that definition. And really want to highlight this idea of innovation and that emergent and complex. And those are some of the ideas I'll come back to in a moment. And also, again, I really emphasize in that previous webinar as well. But another definition that I want to pull in too that I think is really useful is that it's supporting the development of interventions that are innovative and engaging highly complex systems. So very similar type of definition, or that are changing in response to conditions around them. So there's a lot of things that you're having to change and adapt to because of the changing conditions. One of the ways to be able to understand developmental evaluation is in terms of kind of thinking about it as conceptually distinct from summative evaluation and formative evaluation. And let me first talk about summative evaluation because that's probably the one type of evaluation that does seem most conceptually distinct from developmental. And so if you're familiar, summative evaluation is really about measuring program outcomes and impacts. And we think about this as really at the end of an evaluation effort or at the end of a certain kind of frame of the project. So it could be at the end of the project, after a year, that you're engaging in summative evaluation. What could cause more kind of confusion is in thinking about formative evaluation, because formative evaluation is about improvement. It's about improving the way that the program is being delivered. So if you think about formative evaluation and then thinking about developmental evaluation, there could be some confusion in trying to think about, well, what makes those two kind of concepts of evaluation distinct. And one way to be able to think about formative and developmental evaluation is if you think about them as different ends of a continuum, and that we're really talking about differences in degree, or at least that's how I conceptualize it, is differences in degree. And we're talking about it in differences in degree, I think, along three different dimensions. Those dimensions are the nature of the intervention, the complexity of the situation, and also just the overall uncertainty of the implementation as well. So in thinking about the intervention, in general, developmental evaluation usually is appropriate when the initiative itself is less developed, and that formative is more appropriate when it's more developed. So in thinking about that, when I think about it being developed or more or less developed, what I'm thinking about is not so much in terms of what's written on paper, but in terms of how has it actually been developed and implemented and what has already been learned. So with a developmental evaluation, you may have very clear ideas and thoughts about how it's going to be implemented, but it hasn't really been kind of gone through the purification process of implementation and that learning process. Whereas with formative evaluation, that may have already has occurred. The other component is in regards to complexity. And so when thinking about developmental evaluation, you may be experiencing an implementation of an initiative that is impacting on multiple systems and new systems in which relationships are having to be built and having to figure out how to uh, adapt what you were thinking of, what the ideas were about the initiative in response to the complexity. And whereas with formative evaluation, it may impact one, just on less systems overall, and then also that those systems may be slightly more established. So, for instance, an initiative that involves partnership with another department that you already are working with within your institution, that may be more conformative in nature. Whereas if you're working with different departments across different institutions, that may be more developmental in nature. And then the final dimension is whether the agreement on how that's going to be implemented, agreement among the key partners has actually been achieved. And so if there's less agreement, then there's probably more role of developmental evaluation. And then there's more agreement, then there's probably more role with informative. And I should say within all of this is that that is more in terms of, again, just a kind of a pure definition standpoint, and that the approach and some of the characteristics that you want to bring to a developmental evaluation or bring to evaluation, whether it's developmental or formative, can still be applicable. But hopefully that helps in terms of defining out what those differences are. So let me pause there for a moment, Elise, and see if there are any questions.
Yes, we do have a question. I can almost see how sometimes developmental evaluation could encompass both summative and formative evaluation. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I actually would. One of the ways that I often think about developmental evaluation actually comes out of improvement science. And so if you think about the plan, do, see, act model, that there's that kind of rapid feedback loop. And so you can almost think about it in regards to that feedback loop. In terms of how I was defining formative evaluation is more in terms of something that's more established. I think if you look in the literature, if you look across to some of the published works, that's how that's being defined as well. It's a matter of whether it's with formative evaluation something that's a little more established. But I do think in terms of practice, thinking about it as that feedback loop and really being focused in on learning, I think is part of what makes developmental evaluation very distinct.
Thank you. That's all for right now.
Okay, perfect. So let me go on and talk about some of the evaluator and project team characteristics. Because again, kind of going back to that last question, that you can think about that is kind of that feedback from formative evaluation and summative evaluation, or you can think about it in terms of degree. But I do think what also makes developmental evaluation slightly distinct is what the evaluator and project team are bringing in terms of their perspectives. So if you think about that with an evaluation, it's partly a partnership between the evaluator and the project team, particularly when it's developmental, because there's a lot of learning that has to occur. And so both entities need to bring certain, I think, a certain mindset, certain perspective to be able to make that work. So let's first talk about this from the evaluator's perspective. So I think that what the evaluator needs to bring, and I know this is something that we really work on bringing to our clients, is in regards to playing a strong consultative role. So part of that consultative role is in regards to just trying to give feedback, help try to catalyze conversations, help with the use of evaluation findings or providing insights into what the findings are sharing and what the findings are actually telling the project team. And I should say that within that role, it really should be a part dialogue between the evaluator and the project team. The project team still has that subject matter expertise, but because the evaluator is more removed from the project, there may be different things that the evaluator is seeing, what we're seeing, and we want to make sure that we're kind of catalyzing that type of conversation. The other kind of characteristic is that the evaluator should be able to be willing to follow the emergent in terms of the evaluation. If you talked with me about projects, one of the phrases I often use is that we like to live close on projects. And the reason why we like to live close in projects is because so much can emerge over time that if we're not really staying close, meeting, we like to meet minimally monthly during that kind of beginning stages of an initiative because so much can change and we want to make sure that we are gathering data at the right moments to be able to really help the project team make decisions about what the next step should be about the initiative. And then the other piece that I think that evaluators should bring to the evaluation and developmental evaluation is the appreciation that there is a certain amount of vulnerability of the project team and the initiative. And when I say that, I want to be very careful. In terms of being sensitive to that, it doesn't mean that you're not sharing out results. It doesn't mean that you're not providing truth. It's appreciating the fact that the project team has an investment, that whether that investment is because they're very passionate about what they're doing, or the investment is just because of the weight of having a grant and wanting to make sure that they live up to the expectations of what they had outlined in that proposal. I think it's really important that the evaluator has that appreciation. And that the other piece is we often talk about this relationship between evaluation and research, and that evaluation does follow a lot of the guidelines and approaches of research. But I think one of the unique parts of evaluation is that it really does live within human systems. And it's not to say that research doesn't, but it really does live within the human systems. And there just needs to be an appreciation for that in terms of the interactions with the project team. And again, I just want to emphasize it does not mean that you're not providing out the truth. It doesn't mean that you're hiding out findings, but it does mean that in how you're engaging that conversation, you're appreciating the perspective of the project team. Let's take a couple of minutes and look at it from the project team's perspective and what is it some of the things that they need to bring to the evaluation. Well, one is that they just need to be able to have a willingness to be able to share challenges and obstacles and not just successes. And sometimes that willingness to share really reflects an evolution of the relationship. That if you think about what evaluation is in terms of its traditional definition, it's a judgment of the quality of. And so if you are perceiving evaluation, if that's the approach of the evaluation, that it's about the quality of what you're doing, then there would be more reluctance in regards to being able to share out information. But if there is this more emphasis on learning and trying to kind of reflect, then you should be willing to be able to share out what's working, what's not working, so that the evaluator can help play that consultative role. And in some ways, too, it's going to eventually come out in the evaluation. So the earlier that you're sharing that information, the earlier that as a team, there can be some dialogue on what can be done and how those obstacles can be addressed. And I end up already started to share this piece of of what I think the project team needs to bring is that seeking learnings to help take those learnings and help inform the project decision making process. Sometimes I think that in terms of how evaluation is framed, that there's this idea that there's project implementation that lives in one space and evaluation lives in a different space. And they should really be living in the same space. Again, going back to the idea of developmental evaluation coming out of improvement science and that plan, do, see, act model, that those really should complement each other. And so that the project team really wants to be able to take learnings from the evaluation and take those learnings to help on the decision making about the direction of the project. And then finally, something that the project team should just consider as well is just making sure that there's enough capacity in the team to be able to respond to the emergent. And that's emergent in terms of opportunities, some opportunities that emerge that weren't expected, and also being able to address challenges and having the capacity to be able to quickly address challenges and be able to change course to make sure that the initiative is being successfully implemented. So let me go ahead and pause there for a moment and see, Elise, if there are any other additional questions.
We do have a couple of questions. One, can you share more about how you can build a positive energy toward evaluation among the project team?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, you know, that's a good question on multiple levels. I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying before that you want you're in defense of the project in terms of making sure that you're sharing out the right information and that you're telling the truth about the project. So creating the right energy is not so much about hiding out, what the facts are. But I do think it's in part about the perspective that you're bringing to that evaluation and how you're sharing out information, how you're engaging in the dialogue. But I do also would say that that also depends on when the evaluator is brought in. When the evaluator is brought in at the end of a grant life, there's not as much space and just as much time to be able to have those types of conversations or to be able to engage in course correction. So one would be in regards to just being able to engage with the evaluator much earlier. But I do think, again, it's just realizing the humanness of another person. And I think that when you realize that you're dealing with another person who's very passionate about what they're trying to achieve, the language that you use, how you tell the truth will change. And I think that really will help to build trust within that working relationship that you have from the evaluator to the project team. And I should say, I guess I was really answering that from the evaluator's perspective, but I think the project team can also help encourage and ask questions of the evaluator about what does this mean and making sure that information is being obtained at those points that decisions are actually being made.
There's an additional question. Do you think proposal reviewers know enough about developmental evaluation that it's not risky to include it in the proposal to NSF?
That is an excellent question. I I would say in general, I would agree. I don't generally use the language of developmental evaluation if the solicitation doesn't use the language of developmental evaluation. What I use is all the terms around it. So I talk about continuous improvement. I talk about how the project team is going to use the information. So I talk about developmental evaluation without using the exact language because, again, what I think when I'm seeing in solicitations without them using developmental evaluation term, what they're asking for at the beginning of an initiative is some kind of developmental type of evaluation. And so you can talk about it without using the actual word. And I do want to emphasize, too, just real quickly, I don't think that even within a particular project, the type of evaluation that you're completing may evolve. So just because you're using a developmental evaluation approach does not mean that it's not that you're not also folding in formative evaluation and summative evaluation. I think very much so that you want to make sure that you're pulling in what's being done, why it's being done, and what's being learned. And I think that that's what's so key, particularly within NSF, about disseminating information, is so that other people will understand what that learning process was and how you got to the end point where you were. So I'm not sure if there's another question, but I'm going to go on because we have a few minutes left already. So let me just kind of quickly talk about what this looks like in practice. So quickly, here's an example. A project team received funding to increase the retention of undergraduate students in STEM majors. And the project team was proposing to address retention issues by providing peer mentoring, research, and internship opportunities and tutoring support. So let's look at things from the evaluator's perspective first. So we talked about the evaluator should play a strong consultative role. So one way that the evaluator can do this is to provide insights from other projects on what was working in regards to providing tutoring and what's working in terms of really make sure that students are taking advantage of research and internship opportunities. I think something else that we do is really try to connect project teams with other individuals who are doing similar types of work as well. Then also, the evaluator should allow the evaluation to follow emergent factors. So in this way, that if you're conducting an interview or you're gathering data, you're quickly sharing out that information so that the project team can utilize that and then make decisions about, well, are there other kind of data points that you want to make sure that you're gathering? The next is in regards to just being sensitive to the vulnerability of the project team. One way that the evaluator can actually help with that type of conversation is providing kind of quote unquote negative feedback from a learning perspective so that you can help catalyze conversations on what can be done differently. So instead of presenting it as catastrophic, presenting it as what we know isn't working and what can be changed. So using the same example, let's look at things from what the project team would need to bring to the table. So the project team should be willing to share successes and challenges. And so the project team is sharing that they're having a hard time for getting support from faculty to sponsor research opportunities. You can have a dialogue around that. And again, be able to connect, the evaluator may be able to connect that project team with some other project teams who've successfully been able to get buy-in on that. The project team should seek learnings from the evaluation to inform project decision making. The team is meeting regularly with the evaluator to be able to discuss evaluation findings. And I put that in quotation marks because findings sometimes are formal in regards to surveys, but evaluation findings are also what I just reported, not getting buy-in, not being able, running into an obstacle, having to problem solve. That's part of the evaluation findings because you may be impacting or touching on some various systems. The project team has sufficient capacity to be able to take timely action on lessons learned. During the proposal phase, that the project teams just consider how they would address challenges to implementation. And so as a consequence of considering that during the proposal phase, there's capacity that's been written in to be able to address those issues. And I know we are very close to time. I shouldn't say do I dare ask. I love the questions. And so I don't know if there's a quick one that I may be able to answer quickly. If not, I'll follow up afterward.
Yeah, let's try. I've heard the term evaluation capacity building. How does that play into developmental evaluation?
Yeah, I think that I think it plays very strongly within developmental evaluation. So evaluation capacity building is just really in regards to, I think, the understanding of what it takes to be able to implement an evaluation, and then also what it takes in terms of being able to use evaluation information, and what you should be expecting from the evaluation. So I think there's all those different dynamics of evaluation capacity building. I think that part of what happens over time, and part of evaluation capacity building, or ECB as sometimes it's referred to, is the changing in terms of the relationship with the evaluator, and knowing that you're going to be able to have this conversation with the evaluator. And I think that this will evolve over time. There's definitely times when we've worked with clients, the first time that we're interacting with the clients, that we're asked to leave a room as they're, metaphorically, as they're tackling an issue. And then over time, that project team feeling more comfortable having us in the room. So, a lot of this is the evolution. Again, these are human systems. You're working with another person and what they may have in terms of expectations, in terms of how they will work with the project team. But that it definitely does impact on evaluation capacity building. If there's another question, I will make sure to follow up with individuals afterwards. But let me provide this final thought. Ryan Hawk, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Ryan Hawk is a individual. He's a leadership guru who lives actually here in Dayton, Ohio. He's written a couple of books, and his most recent book is The Pursuit of Excellence: The Uncommon Behaviors of the World's Most Productive Achievers. And he has in his book this quotation, which I thought was very appropriate. He says, "Experience is not the best teacher. Evaluated learning from experience is the best teacher." And I think that developmental evaluation really provides that frame from having evaluated learning to be able to be a great teacher for project teams and for other project teams who can leverage that learning as well. So before I say goodbye to everyone, I did want to encourage you to mark your calendars for Thursday, July 1st, for our next webinar on optimizing success and strategies for leveraging program evaluation for project implementation. And also look for a survey from Elise, and so we're always looking for your feedback. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was a very fast, but it was really great to be able to have such great questions from everyone, and to be able to share on this topic that is very meaningful for me and hopefully for you as well. So thank you, and have a great rest of the day.